Hello, welcome to Liberty Wolf. My name is Zach Strong. This is the 7th episode of my podcast. To date, I have covered some controversial issues, including feminism, communism, conspiracy, etc. I hope you will look those up, listen to them, and then subscribe if you like my content. Today we will be talking about another controversial issue. This happened decades ago, and yet it is still a controversial subject. I refer to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the close of World War II. If you ask the average person, they will tell you that these atomic bombings of the Japanese cities were perfectly justified. Sure, perhaps they were sad, perhaps they're tragic, but they were necessary war measures. That's what we always hear. We had to do it to save American lives. And in fact, we actually saved Japanese lives too, because if we would have invaded, we would have lost people and they would have lost people. Instead, they brought the war to a speedy close. That's the official narrative. As usual, the official narrative is wrong. It's a pack of lies. Usually, when the government says something, you pretty much know the opposite is true, or at least somewhere a little further away in degree. They almost never tell the truth. These court historians, they so rarely tell the truth that it's almost laughable. And the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are no exception. Now, I want to start off by just doing a brief intro, something that hopefully will tie in a little bit later. Now, in World War II, you had the Allies on one hand and the Axis powers on the other. The Axis, of course, was led by Germany and Japan, with Italy as a third lesser member. Now, it's interesting. Before the war, there was something called the Comintern Pact. Most people probably have never heard of the Comintern Pact. In fact, most people probably don't even know what the Comintern is. The Comintern is an abbreviated name for Communist International. The Communist International was established by Moscow, by the Bolshevik conspirators in Russia, to be their wing to kind of oversee the international subversion of the world. They had branches throughout the world, in the United States, all over the place. So Germany and Japan, they understood the communist threat very, very well. Japan saw the communists encroaching in China, and they didn't want to have anything to do with that. Germany, they had undergone a de facto communist revolution right after World War I and throughout the 1920s. Under the Weimar Republic, which was a socialist government, and in the early 1930s before Hitler came to power. When Hitler came to power, he actually stopped the communist machinations. He outlawed the communists, did away with their political parties, which were nothing but subversive organs. But they knew very firsthand what the communists could do. There were fire bombings, police murders, murders of politicians, and communists burned down the Reichstag. It was not the Nazis. That's a false conspiracy theory. So, Japan, Germany, Italy, they got together and they signed the Comintern Pact. So, in other words, it's an anti-communist pact. It's significant to me that the three nations that would actually get together and sign an anti-communist pact were the three nations that were utterly obliterated by the Allies during World War II. Isn't that interesting? So just remember that. Remember that Japan's great fear was encroachment of communism in Asia. I'm going to tie this in later. Now, on August 6th, 1945, we dropped our first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. We don't know exact numbers, death toll, but somewhere around 100,000 Japanese lost their lives. This was almost primarily almost exclusively people who were not fighting in the war. In other words, non-combatants, women, children, cripples, old men, people who had no part in the war effort. 3 days later, on the 9th, August 9th, we dropped a second atomic bomb, a bigger atomic bomb, on Nagasaki. Fortunately, fewer people died from the area the bomb blast hit, but somewhere around in the ballpark of 70,000 or so were incinerated. So as a low figure, you have about 170,000 deaths, possibly as many as 200,000 or 300,000 even, when you factor in people who died later from radiation and whatnot. Some of these people are still alive and suffering the effects of these bombings today. Now, at the end of this podcast, I'm going to read a description of exactly what that bombing was like from someone who was on the ground who lived in Hiroshima. It's pretty gory, but I think we need to understand what exactly this was like. Now, before I do that, however, I'm going to discuss something that's very crucial to this whole debate on whether we should have or should not have dropped these atomic bombs. Now, was it necessary? Was it a necessary war measure? Because that's the narrative we always hear. It was necessary. We had to do it. We saved American lives and Japanese lives. We ended the war. I'm sorry, but that's just not true. And the most damning thing is that the American generals at the time, they knew it wasn't true. And they confided in people. They wrote it in their journals. They spoke out. They said it was not true. It was not necessary. Japan was on the verge of defeat and surrender already. In fact, we know in subsequent years, so it's come to light that the Japanese were trying to surrender already. They had tried through third parties to have diplomatic sessions with the United States to discuss surrender. And Germany did the same thing as well. Hitler, before and during World War II, he presented multiple peace offers to the Allies, to the world. We rejected all of them. In fact, most of the time we ignored that they didn't even exist, but they're well documented. And so we have a lot of blood on our hands for rejecting these peace offers. Now, there's an article I want to quote from. Now, I've read these sources independently elsewhere, but this article kind of pulls them together into one spot. And so this article is written by, let's see if I get his name right, Gar Alperovitz. Gar Alperovitz. I'll link it below in case I'm butchering the name. The article was originally published in The Nation on August 6, 2015. It is titled, "The War Was Won Before Hiroshima, and the Generals Who Dropped the Bomb Knew It." Now, there's a little bit of an introduction here, and he goes on. I'm going to skip down to the middle of the article and read a few paragraphs here. He says, quote, "The top American military leaders who fought World War II, much to the surprise of many who are not aware of the record, were quite clear that the atomic bomb was unnecessary, that Japan was on the verge of surrender, and, for many, that the destruction of large numbers of civilians was immoral. Most were also conservatives, not liberals. Admiral William Leahy, President Truman's chief of staff, wrote in his 1950 memoir, I Was There, that, quote, the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. In being the first to use it, we adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make war in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children." Close quote. Now the article continues and says, "The commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, Henry Hap Arnold, gave a strong indication of his views in a public statement only 11 days after Hiroshima was attacked. Asked on August 17th by a New York Times reporter whether the atomic bomb caused Japan to surrender, Arnold said that, quote, the Japanese position was hopeless even before the first atomic bomb fell because the Japanese had lost control of their own air." Close quote. The next quote in this article says, it goes on, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stated in a public address at the Washington Monument 2 months after the bombings that, quote, the atomic bomb played no decisive part from a purely military standpoint in the defeat of Japan. Close quote. It goes on, Admiral William Bull Halsey, Jr., commander of the U.S. Third Fleet, stated publicly in 1946 that, quote, "The first atomic bomb was an unnecessary experiment. It was a mistake to ever drop it. The scientists had this toy and they wanted to try it out, so they dropped it." Close quote. The last one that I will quote from this article comes from General Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Ike was a mass murderer in his own right. I have in mind a podcast that where I'll cover his atrocities later. He slaughtered German POWs after the war was over, and he hated the Germans. And so coming from him, this is a very fascinating quote. He said, he told Secretary of War Henry Stimson, of my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly, because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. Close quote. So here you have the very top echelon of American generals all saying this is not a necessary war measure. It was not necessary to save American lives. Japan was already defeated. From a military standpoint, it was unnecessary. So those of you who think it was necessary, we had to do it to save American lives, what do you say to General Eisenhower? What do you say to Admiral Chester Nimitz? What do you say to these men? These men who had a lot more knowledge than you do, of the first-hand knowledge of this situation. People who were in command, they were the ones giving the orders. They saw it as completely unnecessary. And yet, President Truman and his advisors, they thought this would be a wonderful thing. As Admiral Nimitz said, the scientists had this toy and they wanted to try it out, so they dropped it. That's pretty much what it amounts to. They had this toy, this new weapon, and they had to try it out. They were itching to try it out. They wanted to see what it would do. And, well, the world saw what happened. As 170,000, primarily non-combatants, were incinerated, turned to ash. Now, so if I'm correct, and this was not a necessary war measure, and if I'm also correct in saying that the Japanese did not surrender because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, why did the Japanese surrender? Let's discuss that for a minute. Now, it should be noted that Japan was used to being bombed to smithereens. Before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Allies, the Americans primarily, had obliterated more than 60 Japanese cities. There was not one city over 100,000 people that we had not already bombed. More than 60 had been firebombed to ash. In fact, the single biggest bombing of our campaign against Japan occurred in March of 1945 when we bombed Tokyo. 120,000 Japanese died between March 9th and 10th. We just blew them up and incinerated them, slaughtered 120,000, mainly civilians. And so, if you're a nation and more than 60 of your cities have already been firebombed, you already have 120,000 of your people dying in one night, what's another 100,000? I mean, really, let's just look at it this logically from a military standpoint. Is that what's going to make you surrender? Losing 100,000 people in Hiroshima? Another 70,000 in Nagasaki? Absolutely not. Now, here's an interesting thing. The Japanese Supreme Council, which ruled Japan the last at least year of the war, they met in an emergency meeting on August 9th, the same day the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Interestingly enough, however, they met before the second bombing. Also, they met before their investigative report came back from Hiroshima detailing what had really happened there. They heard that it had been bombed, but they didn't know the details. They didn't know the extent. They just knew, hey, another one of our cities was bombed. And so the Supreme Council meeting on August 9th is significant. It's significant because that is where they, for the very first time, discussed unconditional surrender. That's what the Allies had been demanding, unconditional surrender. So why suddenly, out of the blue, would they discuss unconditional surrender? They hadn't even got the report back yet from Hiroshima. They didn't know 100,000 had died. They just knew, hey, another one of our cities got blown up by the Americans. So what? Over 60 of them already had, including the capital, Tokyo. And this is before the second atomic bombing in Nagasaki. And again, as I already noted, there had not been one city over 100,000 people that had not been bombed already. The Japanese had lost millions of people. They did not suddenly surrender because a few more died in Hiroshima. But something interesting happened August 8th at 11 p.m. on August 8th. Molotov, one of the high-ranking Soviets, informed the Japanese as of tomorrow, so 1 hour away, as of August 9th, a state of war will exist between the USSR, the Soviet Union, and Japan. Now that is what called forth this special meeting of the Supreme Council. They were absolutely terrified that the Soviets would invade their islands. Now, even though Japan had signed a pact with Germany years previous, and though they were supposed to and had agreed to attack the Soviet Union's rear in the east in Siberia, they in fact secretly signed a treaty of neutrality with Stalin in 1941. That treaty called for a 5-year period of neutrality. That would end in the spring of 1946. So that's a little bit of duplicity on Japan's part against Germany. The war would have been over against Russia if Japan would have actually fulfilled their end of the bargain and attacked in 1941 with Germany. But that's another story. The point is that the Soviet Union, they broke that neutrality pact and decided to invade on August 9th, essentially. So this is what brought the Japanese Supreme Council into a frenzy. They finally started discussing unconditional surrender. Okay, we need to surrender now. The Soviets are coming. Remember, I had mentioned earlier that Japan, along with Germany and Italy, had signed the Anti-Comintern Pact. Japan was reasonably terrified that communism would take over all of Asia. They did not want the communist menace to get to their home islands. I mean, the Soviets were planning to invade the northernmost island, or one of the more northern islands of Hokkaido, Japan. They sliced down through Manchuria, decimating the few Japanese troops that were left. Most of the Japanese troops had just been brought back to the home islands in preparation for an American invasion. So when the Soviet troops came down through their rear in their kind of soft underbelly in violation of their neutrality treaty, that's when they decided we need to surrender. Remember, this was before Nagasaki, before the bombing there, and before they really had received word of what happened in Hiroshima. And so it couldn't have been the bombs. It just couldn't have been. And as the American generals abundantly testified, there was no reason to do it. From a military standpoint, there was absolutely no reason. Japan was ready to surrender. And as I noted, Japan had been trying to surrender previously. Now, I hope some of this evidence convinces you a little bit that you don't blithely support the droppings of our atomic bombs, the incineration of men, women, children, non-combatants, civilians living in cities that have nothing to do with the war effort. I hope you don't support that. It was a war crime, and it was a tragedy. Tragedy is an excellent word to use. It's a tragedy I hope that we avoid in our future, because we set the precedent. We brought forth, as I believe it was Chester Nimitz said, this new form of barbarism. Another man who lived at the time who called it a tragedy, who called it savagery, fiendish butchery was his exact term. His name was J. Reuben Clark Jr., leader in my church. He had served in positions in the government, was very influential. He saw World War II coming years before, and he warned America not to get involved. He warned that our sons would be slaughtered on foreign soil for international purposes. He knew it was coming. He saw the coming creation of a international world body, which ended up coming, the United Nations. And so he warned about it. And so after the war, this is comes from October 1946, a speech he gave. He said the following: as the crowning savagery of the war, we Americans wiped out hundreds of thousands of civilian population with the atom bomb in Japan, few if any of the ordinary civilians being any more responsible for the war than we were, and perhaps most of them no more aiding Japan in the war than we were aiding America. Military men are now saying that the atom bomb was a mistake. It was more than that. It was a world tragedy. Thus, we have lost all that we have gained in the years from Grotius, so 1625, to 1912. And the worst of this atomic bomb tragedy is not that not only did the people of the United States not rise up and protest against the savagery, not only did it not shock us to read of this wholesale destruction of men, women, and children, and cripples, but that it actually drew from the nation at large a general approval of this fiendish butchery. Close quote. It really was fiendish butchery. It was unnecessary, 100% unnecessary, according to our generals, according to anyone with common sense and a grasp on history and the situation with the Soviet Union, with Japan's war position at the time. And I hope that sticks in your mind, that this was a fiendish butchery. It was savagery that was unnecessary, unnecessary, unnecessary. Now I want to read something that brings maybe a little closer to home with the emotion, the feeling of what the people went through, what we put them through, what our leaders did on our behalf that gained such great approval from Americans at large. This story comes from a book, Japan at War, An Oral History, by Haruka Tayo Cook and Theodore F. Cook. This particular account comes from Matsushige Yoshido. He worked for a newspaper in Hiroshima. At the time, he was attached to an army division. He said this. This is his account of living through the atomic bomb dropping on Hiroshima and its aftermath, just the horrific, bloody aftermath. This is what he said. I was about to get in when terrific sparks had jumped from the spot where the electric lines entered the house. I heard a tremendous cracking noise, like trees being torn apart, and at the same time there was a brilliant flash of immaculate white, like the igniting of the magnesium we used to use for taking photographs. I couldn't see a thing. I was sitting in a six-mat room, half naked, my shirt out on the line. I sensed an explosive wind like needles striking me. It seemed only for a moment before my wife came in. A bomb fell, she just said. I grabbed her hand and we ran outside. When I fully came to my senses, we were already squatting down in a hollow in a sweet potato field across the train tracks from our house. We thought an ordinary bomb had hit our house directly or exploded right near it. It was absolutely black outdoors. I couldn't see my wife's face, even though we were pressed right up against each other. I thought my wife and I had been saved as I felt the warmth of her hand in mine. My heart felt ready to split open. It was beating so fast. Gradually, the lowest edge of the fog seemed to rise a little, and I could see. A 4-story wooden fire station nearby had collapsed in an instant. I had to get to headquarters. So he runs in, grabs his gear, and he says that I noticed that I myself was bleeding from little bits of glass from chest to face. And then he runs through town, and he describes a little bit of what he saw. He said, I approached the city hall about 1.1 kilometers from the hypocenter. Both it and the western fire station were in flames. It was a sea of fire. I couldn't make my way to the newspaper office, so I returned to the western side of the Miyuki Bridge and tried to head toward the city center by passing along the bank of the river. But fireballs were rolling down the road. There was nobody to be seen. If I hang around here, I thought, I'll be swallowed up in these fires, so I returned to the bridge. You had to weave through the streets, avoiding the bodies. People's bodies were all swollen up. Their skin, burst open, was hanging down in rags. Their faces were burnt black. I put my hand on my camera, but it was such a hellish apparition that I couldn't press the shutter. I hesitated about 20 minutes before I finally pushed it and took the first picture. The man in this picture might be a policeman giving first aid to people for burns using cooking oil. A can of oils behind there. This woman's hair was burned frizzy. They were all barefoot because their shoes had stuck to the asphalt. The woman was holding a baby in the crook of her arm. She was half naked. The baby's eyes were closed, either dead or in shock. She was running around crying to her child, "Please open your eyes." The baby was probably already dead. You can see in the picture that her legs are slightly blurry. The film was slow then, so you can tell that she was running. I approached and took the second shot. It was such a cruel sight. The viewfinder of the camera was clouded with my tears when I took it. It was around 11 o'clock. The whole area was still under fire and smoke. The bottom of the picture shows the asphalt. People lying along the upstream railing of the bridge, which had fallen onto the surface. They're using it as a pillow. The people on the downstream side of the bridge didn't have that luxury and were lying directly on the road. Their bodies were burned head to toe. They were covered in asphalt. They mistook me for a soldier. "Please, Mr. Soldier, give me some water," they'd call out faintly. I had an armband on that said military reporter. I could only reply, "The relief unit will come soon, so please hold on." I returned home, but left again about 2 o'clock. The fire was dying out. I set my feet towards the center of the town again, with a mind to go to headquarters or the office, but corpses were everywhere, and smoldering ruins were still sending up plumes of flame here and there. It was hot, I suppose, but maybe my nerves were paralyzed. I didn't feel a thing. Japanese homes were made of wood and collapsed easily from the force of the blast. So too did most of the shops and other buildings. Many people were trapped under the wreckage. They couldn't pull themselves out. This area was hit by the winds with a velocity of 440 meters per second and thermal waves of several hundred degrees centigrade. Fires began spontaneously. Even had the people gotten out, they couldn't have outrun the flames. Many people burned to death. The corpses I saw on the August 7th, were black and hardened, but on that day, August 6th, they were still burning from below, and the fat of the bodies was bubbling up and sputtering as it burned. That was the only time I've seen humans roasting. I walked on flames to reach the office building. It was made of reinforced concrete, so I was confident that the inside wouldn't be burned down. I'd left my other camera in my locker there. I was ready to enter the building when I saw piles of ash and red coal glowing inside. I took only a few steps in before I pulled back. Nearby, I saw a burnt trolley car halfway up the sidewalk, probably blown there by the wind. I didn't go near it, but walked toward Kamiyacho. There I saw another burned trolley car at a curve. It looked like people were still on it, so I approached, put my foot on the step, and peered inside. 15 or 16 people were there, all dead. Kamiyacho had been only 250 meters from the hypocenter. They probably died instantly when the pressure of the blast wind caused their internal organs to rupture. Then they burst into flame and burned together with the car. All of them were naked. I had my foot on the rear doorstep. I didn't really stare at them, but recoiled in shock. The doors and windows were charred. Only the skeleton of the train remained. I didn't remember if it was hot or not. I don't think I grasped the doorframe when I looked in. I thought about taking a picture. I even put my hand on the camera, but it was so hideous I couldn't do it. He goes on and says, I did take a picture of people lined up to register for disaster relief. The seated policeman, whose own head was wrapped in a dirty bandage, was giving them documents to prove that they had all suffered a disaster. With this piece of paper, they could get rations or board a train as victims. In it, you can see they're also passing out hard biscuits, 1 bag per person. I myself received one. We ate it that night. We had no water, no electricity. We had no idea when airplanes might come again. He says, I returned home about 5 o'clock. My niece came to the house. Her face and half her body were seriously burned. She couldn't get back to her own place. Her shoes had gotten stuck in the asphalt and come off, so she'd walked barefoot. The soles of her feet were burned and swollen. We had no medicine, so we just fanned her to cool her some. Maggots, like tiny threads of silk, many of them, were already infesting her wounds. Humans were burned, but flies survived. We spent the night sitting on the wreckage of the fire station. I could see fires burning in scattered places toward the center of town. He goes on and talks a little bit more. talks about the ordeal. At the end, he says this: I didn't feel any particular hatred toward the Americans or Australian soldiers who came to Hiroshima. I was actually an A-bomb victim inside my house, but I never suffered directly from it. I'm a shade anemic. I find it strange I haven't fallen ill. I'm often asked why I didn't take more pictures. Some even criticize me for that. It makes me angry. How can they ask such a thing? They didn't see the reality. It was too overwhelming. I wasn't the only one who had a camera that day. Other people walked around with cameras, but nobody else took pictures. Now the fact is, some people did take pictures. We have a few that exist, but we know that many of them were confiscated, destroyed, censored by the American occupation. They didn't want anyone, especially Americans back at home, to see how horrific this was. This was a first-hand account. This is what some of these people really went through. Hundreds of thousands of people. They had to go through this. They had to suffer this. And for what? It was an unnecessary thing. We didn't need to do it. Japan was already going to surrender. And yet we did it. As Admiral Nimitz said, the scientists had a toy and they wanted to drop it. So we set a really deadly precedent. One day, we will have to fight Russia and China. Russia and China have more nukes than the rest of the world. Russia has the most of any person in the world. The threat of nuclear war from Russia has not gone down. It has actually increased. Under Putin, the Russians have revamped and upgraded and modernized their military doctrine. They actually call for a wider use of nuclear weapons on a much more regional scale too. Tactical nuclear weapons. So if they ever get involved in a major war, their military doctrine calls for a widespread use of nuclear weapons. If we think that we can fight them one day without being nuked, we're delusional. They are the great threat in the world. And yet, we can't be absolved of blame for horrific acts as well. These acts were completely unnecessary. They didn't have to happen. In fact, the war didn't have to happen. Again, that's a podcast for a different day. There's a lot of blood on American leaders' hands. And unfortunately, today, we still cheer and approve of this butchery, this fiendish butchery, savagery. Why do we do that? What kind of precedent is that setting? I want to end by reading a quote from the same man I quoted earlier, J. Reuben Clark Jr. He said, speaking of America, he said, "Our policy has brought us, and pursued, will continue to bring us, only the hatred of nations now, and we cannot thrive on that, financially or spiritually, and certain war hereafter, with a list of horrors and woes we do not now even surmise. We must learn and practice, as a nation and as a world, the divine principles of the Sermon on the Mount. There is no other way." A few years back, when Ron Paul was running for president, he suggested that we use the golden rule in our foreign policy. He was literally booed by the audience. This is the level we're at. We've been so desensitized, we've been so propagandized to think that our actions are perfectly just, especially against the Nazis or the Japs, that we approve of this type of butchery, the dropping of atomic bombs on cities that had nothing to do with the war effort, and that were inhabited by nothing but civilians. This is reprehensible. It's a war crime. It's an atrocity. And it's truly an American tragedy. And it's a precedent that is going to come back and bite us one day, unless we seriously repent and change our actions. And so I just want to leave you with that, to ponder these ideas as we commemorate August 6th and 9th, the droppings of our atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. And this is Zach Strong, signing off for Liberty Wolf. Join me next time. Sic Semper Tyrannis. Long live liberty.